Okay, welcome back everybody. I'm going to cover prosecuting crimes involving victims with disabilities, and Leslie did a really good job in covering some issues around statistics with regard to people with disabilities and how they are victimized at incredible rates. I'm not going to go through all these statistics, but what we do know, these are the most recent statistics from Department of Justice in 2012, showing that people with disabilities are victimized at an incredible rate with regard to non-fatal crimes, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, which includes sexual assaults, and I'll come back to sexual assault in a moment. Leslie also covered the barriers for victims with disabilities, and when I originally talked about some of the barriers to cooperating with the criminal justice system, so now we have a whole nother layer of barriers when we're talking about someone who is not only a victim of crime but also has some type of disability. So there's a whole nother layer of barriers to cooperation and being able to deal with the criminal justice system. Some of the types of crimes we see when we talk about people with disabilities, financial theft, fraud, and scams. And as our culture ages, we're seeing more and more crimes against the elderly and different types of crimes against the elderly who may also be disabled. Physical and emotional abuse, as Leslie covered, can be both by a stranger or a caregiver, and it can include interpersonal battering, and I'm going to talk about that, especially as in this context of an elder situation. And we may think an elder couple don't abuse one another physically or emotionally, but that's absolutely not true, and violence can continue on later in life. Sexual abuse and neglect, and I loved what Leslie said about talking about abuse and neglect as if it is not a crime. These are crimes. There are special things that we can do to investigate and prosecute crimes with people with disabilities when our victim has disabilities. And in sex crimes, one of the tools that investigators regularly use is what we call the pretext call. And that's where we ask a victim to call the perpetrator on the phone, while of course this call is being recorded, and somehow get them to admit, maybe ask them to apologize for what they've done. Now, that may be a really difficult or in fact impossible thing to do if your victim has some sort of disability which prohibits or impedes their ability to communicate, whether it's an intellectual disability or some other physical disability that limits their ability to communicate. But we don't have to necessarily use the victim in a pretext call. We can use a family member, a friend, a caretaker can make this pretext call. So the call goes something like this. We get maybe a friend or a family member to call the perpetrator on the phone and say, hey, the victim, Sally, told me this was happening, and she's very, very upset, and I don't know how to explain it to her. Is there some reason, is there something you could say to her or something you could tell me about what happened so that I can try to make everything right? And you make it some sort of a confession out of that. So that is one of the tools that we use when our victim may not be able to communicate themselves. Leslie touched on the issue of consent, a common defense in sex crimes, all sex crimes, but certainly a common defense when we have a sex crime against someone who may have some type of disability. But there are a lot of ways that we can show through the investigation and the prosecutorial process that consent was not possible. Consent may not be able to be given because of an intellectual capacity, and I'll talk about how we can use some of that evidence in court. Consent in a caregiver relationship, Leslie touched on that, where it may be appropriate in some caregiver situations for the victim or for people to have a sexual relationship with one another, and then again it may not. Secondary disabling conditions are something that I'll come back to in a moment. Sexual history is something that we can look at, certainly to prove or not prove the issue of consent. If the victim has never had sex with anyone before, certainly that's something to look at when we're looking at whether or not they actually gave consent to a sexual relationship. And sexual education. What, if any, sexual education has the victim had, and how does that play into their relationship and their ability to give consent or not? Coming back to senior interpersonal violence, interpersonal battering. This can happen in a lot of different contexts for seniors, okay? It can be an ongoing lifelong partner, where this cycle of violence continues all the way into later in life. And while later in life it may not be as violent as it had been earlier on, it's still an abusive, dangerous relationship. Sometimes what we see with our seniors is when their initial partner or spouse may die, they later in life have a new partner. They may not marry that partner, they may live as roommates, they may be companions with one another, but that doesn't mean there isn't the potential for violence to occur in their relationships. And this can be a real challenge for prosecutors when you're, I have prosecuted several cases where the couple was violent with one another, and it's really hard for jurors to imagine because you've got two people that look like your grandma and your grandpa. And my grandma and grandpa, I don't think ever abused one another. Certainly we never saw anything like that growing up as kids. And it's hard to imagine that people later in life may have these same issues. So we work with our prosecutors to help them educate judges and jurors about these issues and that they do carry on later in life. Caregiver stress. One of the partners or spouses may be the caretaker in the relationship, and caretaker stress leads to physical violence later in life. And of course, dementia. My father-in-law has dementia, and my mother-in-law, bless her heart, at 87 is his caretaker. And he's a lovely, charming man and always has been, but with dementia, he has gotten aggravated because he doesn't really understand sometimes what's happening. And he lashes out at her, at least verbally so far. We haven't seen anything physical yet, but we're monitoring that situation because he becomes angry and frustrated easily, and we are very concerned for her well-being. Reverse, what that's talking about is a dynamic that happens where maybe in their younger years, a couple, maybe we'll say that the male is the perpetrator of violence in the family. And as they age together, maybe he becomes infirm and she becomes his caretaker. And she has a lot of pent-up years of anger and frustration and may end up abusing him later in life as his caregiver. Touching briefly on LGBTQ issues also, when you have a senior who falls into the LGBTQ community, you may have an additional layer of barriers and difficulties and lifelong marginalization, more likely to live alone, less likely to have insurance. We've seen all this controversy around whether or not people can be insured by their partner if they fall into one of these communities. And more at risk for falls, malnutrition, and depression because often they live alone. So in the courtroom, as prosecutors, how do we overcome these obstacles in the courtroom? And for those of you who are working in family court and other aspects of the court criminal justice system, how do you overcome these obstacles? So the first thing we train prosecutors is you have to become familiar with a particular disability. There's such a wide spectrum. I've had victims that have so many different types of conditions and disabilities. And the first thing you have to do is get to know them, get to understand it. What are the limitations? What are the obstacles? What is their daily life like? Because if you don't understand it, you aren't going to be able to adequately advocate for them in court. You aren't going to be able to communicate to a jury what those obstacles may be. Using victim advocates, of course. I want to go back to what Leslie brought up as well, talking about the level of the disability and the particular factual situation may lend itself to the proper charging of a hate crime. So we're encouraging prosecutors to include this in their charging decisions. Getting a thorough review of the records, IEPs. A lot of the records from caregivers and various caregiving institutions may give a prosecutor real insight into limitations, obstacles, and some of the history I talked about just a moment ago in a sex crime case. What is this person's history? What is their ability to understand and communicate?
The regional centers will provide extensive assessment information, and in some cases they will pay for assessments, for forensic assessments for victims with developmental disabilities.
That's terrific. And I've looked at some of those assessments, and they are so thorough and they are so helpful in really getting the full picture of a victim in one of these cases. Using victim advocates is an absolute must. Getting out and training investigators and police officers, and that is no small challenge. Leslie touched on the fact that some of the institutions have their own police force, and they don't go to the police academy. They don't get the same training that police officers get in some circumstances, and don't necessarily have the same requirements for ongoing training. Providing regular and meaningful training to police officers in general is a very difficult task with turnover and all the various things that they go through. It's really hard necessarily even to get an audience to train police officers. So that is one of our biggest challenges. Developing a team approach. When I do longer presentations on this issue, I can give you about 3 slides of various organizations and people that you can look to put a team approach together to prosecuting one of these cases. Understanding the methods for communication. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to show you a brief video of this lovely, charming woman named Roma, and I'll talk a little bit about what the prosecutor had to do to understand and develop a way to communicate with her. Utilizing experts in the area, school psychologists, evaluators, can be extremely valuable. And one of the things Leslie touched on too is sometimes prosecutors look at this list that I'm talking about here. This is a lot of work. It takes extra time and attention, and you have to really want to do this. So we really need to make sure we have the right prosecutors in place who are taking on these challenging cases. Considering Crawford, what I'm referring to is the Crawford Supreme Court case, which limits certain types of hearsay testimony. When I was a baby prosecutor prosecuting domestic violence cases, we didn't have the Crawford case, so I could prosecute a case without a victim coming to court. Did it all the time. But that's not the case now. We have much more stringent standards. But all of this information that I've talked about here before, looking at records, while a victim's statement might not be able to, a tape recorded statement might not be admissible in court for the truth of the matter, it might be admissible in court to show the extent of a disability or the inability of a victim to communicate. So there are other ways that we can use this evidence, even if the hearsay rules may typically prevent them. So for prosecutors and anybody who's going to work in court, where you're going to have somebody that needs to come to court who has a certain type of disability, you need to know the rules. And I love to have the rules on my side when I'm the prosecutor, so I love this nice long list of rules that only I get to use, right? Because my victim has the disability. So a witness who has a disability may not have to take the oath as other witnesses do. They can just come to court and promise to tell the truth. That may be sufficient. The evidence code also allows us to use leading questions if a dependent person has a substantial cognitive impairment. Evidence code section, I'm sorry, did you have a question? Oh, I thought I missed your hand. Evidence code section 1109, and I should have put 1108 up there as well, are code sections which allow us to bring in prior bad acts of either sexual assault or domestic violence. Evidence code 765, not a lot of prosecutors know about this or use this section, but The court, that means the judge and the people in the courtroom, have a duty to protect witnesses from harassment, embarrassment, and unnecessary questioning. And that may be a very valuable code section to limit a defense attorney's ability to perhaps question a victim in a way that is harassing or maybe embarrassing to them. Evidence Code 8, Penal Code Section 859.1 allows a preliminary hearing to be closed in certain kinds of cases. And you're going to have your best success with that code section in a probably in a sexual assault case where the information is maybe embarrassing or difficult for your victim who has a disability. More rules. I love it. More rules for me, from my side. The prelim can be delayed a day to accommodate special needs of somebody who has a disability. Penal Code Section 931.21 allows for a support person in certain types of cases, including a grand jury. And sometimes we use the grand jury in criminal cases because we don't want to do a preliminary hearing. A grand jury is, in some ways, a secret proceeding where the defense attorney is not allowed to be present, and that might be a very valuable tool in a case where a victim has a disability or some reason why the case may be difficult for them. And Penal Code Section 1336 and Evidence Code Section 1380 allow for a conditional exam. A conditional exam is where a victim or a witness may be recorded, videotaped, prior to coming to court. There are a number of different special circumstances where that might be allowed. You might have a victim, an elder, who you're afraid is so frail they may pass away before a case goes to trial. The wheels of the criminal justice system move slowly, and a smart defense attorney may try to purposely delay a case as many times as they can, especially if you have someone who has a disability or someone who's frail, may not make it to court, or may not remember what happened later on, or as time passes they may become less and less of a good witness in court. So that is a tactic that can be used. So what you can do ahead of time is get a conditional exam. I've done it in a number of different kinds of cases, from domestic violence, sexual assault, victims with disability, to gang cases where we're afraid our witness could be potentially killed prior to a trial. So what happens in those situations, a conditional exam can take place anywhere. It doesn't necessarily have to happen in a courtroom. I've done them in all kinds of locations where the judge picks a location because maybe we have security reasons or something, and do them with the defense attorney present. Both sides ask questions. The judge makes rulings on the questions just like they would in court, but it preserves the testimony for a later trial in the event that the victim, for whatever reason, may not be available. You have to prepare your judge and your jury if someone has a disability. You can't just have the person come into court. Leslie talked about a very unfortunate case where the judge wouldn't let evidence of someone's disability come into court. I have had very positive experiences with the courts when I've had a victim I've had victims with numbers of different types of disabilities and need special accommodations, and I have to say that the judges and the court staff I've worked with over the years bent over backwards to make sure the accommodations were appropriate. And at the end, when I show you the video about Roma and what happened to her when she had to testify in court, and she talks about how the court staff was extremely helpful to her, it actually made her experience as painless as it could be given the circumstances. So once you've convinced your judge and the court staff that these special accommodations have to be made for various reasons, you have to make sure your jury knows ahead of time as well. You don't want them to be surprised when someone comes into court. So how do you do that? You have to talk to them during jury selection. You have to make sure that people don't have some sort of bias about those that may have a disability and how they may view their credibility. So it's something you have to prepare your jurors for, and you have to get a commitment that they're going to assess your witness who may have a disability whatever kind, in the same way they would assess any other type of witness. So you need to get that promise and commitment from potential jurors. So Roma, as you will see in the video, it's a very brief video. She has no intellectual disability. Okay, she is, and you will see that she is very clear, very charming, but she cannot communicate vocally. The way she communicates is in a number of different ways. There's a very long video clip that shows how she communicates. So one way she communicated with the prosecutor was these huge binders that she would be able to just point to pictures and concepts and ideas. And this prosecutor spent so much time with her that at one point they almost didn't need the binders. She could actually just sort of figure out exactly what Roma was trying to tell her. She also has a computer. I'm not sure if you can see it in the video, but this computer that has these very large keys on it, and she can actually type on this computer keyboard. And Roma was sexually assaulted by her caregiver over a significant period of time. The evening caregiver was the person who did this to her. And she had a very hard time reporting the crime, first of all, because she was scared. The place that she was living in, she was with the exception of this caregiver perpetrator, she was very happy where she lived. She didn't want to be moved in any way. She was scared that the other people in the facility might turn against her if she told on this person. And she ended up having to go to court. The case settled at some point mid-trial, and I'm not sure why. They don't actually give us that reason, but she actually had to go to court and testify. And this is the note that is on Roma's door, where anybody who comes in can understand where she's coming from. I love this. I mean, the first time I saw the video of Roma, I wanted to find out where she lived, and I wanted to go and meet her. She's such a remarkable person. And she had a lot of barriers to overcome, first with the investigators, who didn't know what to make of how to communicate with her. Then she just got lucky that she got this terrific prosecutor who was willing to spend the incredible amount of time it took to build a relationship with her and be able to prepare her for testifying in court. And then she apparently got lucky and had a court staff that was willing to make accommodations for her.
Roma wrote a letter about the process of going to court, and she wrote this. It was to be read in the courtroom at the disposition of the case. So Roma would like me to read this for her. Yes, I was afraid about going to court. I was afraid people, particularly the judge, would not believe me because they would assume things about me that were not true. I was afraid they would think I was mentally retarded or stupid because I don't speak clearly. I have encountered that a lot in my life. I was afraid they wouldn't have the patience to listen to my story. It takes me a longer time to communicate than most people, and sometimes people don't wait until I'm finished or they guess wrong about what I'm saying before I am done. The court personnel helped me make a very scary process feel much more comfortable. Before my court appearance, they showed me around the courthouse and they answered any questions I asked. I had a lot of questions. They spoke to me in a patient and respectful way. I think if they had not been so helpful and nice, I might not have had the courage to go forward with my case. The questions were directed to me. The judge and the lawyers looked at me when they asked me a question and waited patiently while I answered on my computer. They showed the respect for my intelligence that I deserve. The bad experiences I had in the courtroom were the same as anyone else. It was hard to be questioned by the defendant's lawyer. He had to accuse me of lying. It was also hard to see and point to the defendant. A courtroom experience is very difficult for everyone, but it is more difficult for a person with disabilities. It is so important for people working in the courts to pay attention to the physical needs, like accessibility, of a person with disabilities. It is very important to be open to and patient with other forms of communication when a person has difficulty with speech. Court workers should be aware of different types of disabilities so they don't make wrong assumptions. The court workers that I dealt with were very helpful in meeting my needs, but I know that that is not the case everywhere. Patience, respect, and understanding are virtues.
So that's just a short clip from a 2 DVD set that we have at CDA, which talks and teaches prosecutors and investigators about how to work with victims with a variety of different disabilities. It talks about children with autism, teaching prosecutors how to work with children when we're putting them on the stand when they may be developmentally delayed. There's some charming video clips, some really amazing things that happen in court with kids and how truly compelling they are. When prosecutors are afraid of taking on some of these kinds of cases, I mean, who would be afraid of taking Roma to court, right? I mean, my goodness, how more compelling of a victim could you possibly have? And in one of the video clips, there's this little boy, he's so funny. So the prosecutor's trying to get him qualified when children or someone with perhaps a developmental disability has to be qualified, right, in court. So they have to show that they have the ability to tell the truth and communicate in court. And so this little boy is developmentally delayed, but he is very precise in how he communicates. And so the prosecutor has this little carved wooden duck, and this is the tool that she always uses with kids, whether they're disabled or not, to explain to the court that they understand certain things and what's true and what's a lie. And so this duck is it's carved out. It's a really beautiful carved duck, and it's painted with all these different colors. So the feathers they're red, blue, green. The beak has a different color. So she's going through the colors on this duck with him so he can prove to the judge and the jury that he understands things and knows what the truth and what a lie is. And when she asks him to explain what colors the feathers are, he takes the duck and he points to every single feather. So he says, blue, 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 yellow, 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 green, green, green. Every single feather he has to identify, the color, where a child might just say, well, it's blue, green, and red. But he was very precise in his testimony, and it's so adorable and charming. I'm sure the jury must have been just, bowled over by, what a great kid he was. So we use these videos. A lot of them are, as the situation with Roma, obviously an amazing success story in some of these cases. Obviously, all these cases don't end up like this, and we don't have these kinds of outcomes in every case. But we hope that we can inspire prosecutors and investigators to not be afraid of these cases and really put the time and the effort and the energy into them to successfully prosecute them and help women like Roma feel empowered through the process and come out on the other end, at least feeling like people acknowledged her and respected her through the process. So with that, I will turn it over to the next speaker.
Hello everyone, I'm so pleased to be here to be able to speak to all of you about the deaf community and domestic violence. Deaf people generally, the statistics in the United States, about 38 million are deaf and hard of hearing. This also includes elderly, late deafened, so there's a wide range of deaf people within our community, and that includes our late deafened and related to age. And about 4,000 cases sudden hearing loss occur each year. That could be from a tragic car accident or illness. American Sign Language is the third most used language And that is the language that is being taught in most colleges and high schools in the United States. So the statistics shows that it's the third most used, but it really depends on which study. For example, it could be third or fourth, so it really depends. It could be between the third to the fourth most used language. And then there's approximately 9,000 certified interpreters in the United States, but most of them do not have certifications. So don't realize that you have a certified interpreter. It's not to your best benefit to have an uncertified interpreter because there's no way of knowing unless you ask. And certification just shows that they meet a certain criteria, minimum qualifications. Real briefly, I want to describe and explain about American Sign Language, which was a separate, distinct language apart from English. And a lot of things are borrowed from English in ASL, just like other languages as well. But it's not English on the hands. It has its own complete grammatical rules and syntax. It includes facial, affect, which is grammatical markers, tense, adjectives, adverbs are displayed on facial affect. There's also a lot of use of space, and that's related to grammar purposes in visual languages. It's a 3D language, and it's not same as a linear language in spoken language. Throughout our country, signing may vary. There are regional variations. A lot of people ask me, in ASL, is that standard? Is that universal? But it is not. Once you go to another country, we don't know that country's language until you learn it. Now, speaking about deaf people themselves, you may think, well, how do I see that? Because you may think and aware that deaf people generally is being placed as part of the disabled group. So if they have a hearing impairment, we automatically are lumped into other disability groups. But in our community, we don't see ourselves as disabled. We're a linguistic minority. And we identify ourselves as other cultural groups with other languages. We have the same similar experiences. So it may be difficult. And how is it for hearing people not to understand why we don't see ourselves as part of the disability group? But that's the reality of it is. We are thrilled when we have a deaf child. We are happy to see that we are more or less visual beings. And we're an ethnic group of people. We see ourselves as one of a kind of species under Homo sapiens. Where there's hearing, that's one of a kind, and then there's deaf, and that's how we see and view ourselves in the world. So hopefully that you can understand this concept. It's not something that we feel, oh, okay, we should just embrace it, that we're deaf, and we should just accept it and come to terms with it and move on with our life. That's not how we see, it's not how we feel. We feel it's a natural being. Just like you are hearing people, you don't call yourself hearing people, you just say, I'm just a person. And I'm just a person too. And we use a different language, and we use a visual language using our hands. When we try to explain what deaf culture is and how is that passed through, and how is that shared within our community? Well, it's passed on through state schools for the deaf or large groups of deaf and hard of hearing programs throughout mainstream settings. We have, in the day, we used to have so many deaf clubs, organizations that specifically serves the deaf and hard of hearing. But because deaf clubs, people would come together. But because of the technology, that has pretty much reduced the number of deaf clubs, and that impacted our deaf clubs and our attendance to those, because there's other ways that we can now contact and communicate with each other. Most deaf children are, about 90% are born from hearing families, and only 10% are born to deaf families like myself. Out of those 10%, they pass on that language and culture from deaf families onto their deaf children, where 90% of those deaf children born to hearing families, they pick up language and culture through other deaf peers in their school environment or their deaf clubs or deaf organizations. English tends to be our second language, and 90% of those deaf children from hearing families means the first obvious natural language in the home is more or less English. And they use different communication methods or models in order to communicate within their home, if the home primarily speaks English. So they're trying to teach their deaf child something like English. The deaf child does not pick up English the same way as hearing children pick up English from hearing families. You have to go to school and learn sign and attach it to the English language to be able to develop your second language and be able to master it. So deaf culture, let's talk about the values. What is entailed in deaf culture? First, we see ourselves as a race. We value our schools for the deaf, our deaf clubs, our organizations, deaf gatherings, if you will, activities that's for maybe the American River Bike Club for the deaf, because we all have a shared experience and we share the same language. So that culture of how we express ourselves and communicate with each other. Whereas hearing people do not understand us, and we are not able to show our culture as freely, or our beliefs or behavior is clueless to most hearing people in hearing society. The medical perspective, as you may know, the pathological perspective, has always been that they view deaf people as a mistake or they're disabled. Parents who find out their deaf child or deaf infant is tested and they're deaf, they go through, the doctor sends them and tells the parents to go see an audiologist. That's the first form of option, a choice to who to go to as an expert to help them deal with their deaf child. The audiologist will give them all these options about fixing their hearing problem. Maybe after explaining all these other options, they might share with them that you can use ASL, but they are not strong proponent of American Sign Language. So the very first day, a child is failed after a few hours of being born into the world, and parents see and being taught that their child may fail, that they're broken. Now we have technology. When we talk about technology and the advancement of that, how does that come into play? A lot of it came from the invention of how we can communicate better, specifically with the deaf community. So Alexander Graham Bell was famously known as the inventor of the phone, but unfortunately he wasn't really the real inventor. But anyhow, he was very autistic and very oppressive against deaf people. And he was actually part of a eugenics movement, and that's where Hitler received his idea of eugenics from Alexander Graham Bell and others who were part of that group. He, of course, had passed away a long time ago, but this organization is very well known, and there's a lot of oral organizations that support his philosophy that deaf people need to be more hearing. They need to go through all these different types of therapies and fixing their problem. And it's still prevalent today. They have very strong influences in the community, the schools, hospitals, and so forth. I want to speak about collectivism. Oppression against a deaf person from the hearing community, or the system oppresses a deaf person because they do not understand the deaf people. So we tell each other and we share in our community about what's happening in the world and how do we face it, how do we overcome it. And there's a small number, of course, of deaf people compared to the hearing society, so it's very easily for us to be able to work as a community and share information with one another. For example, using Facebook. It's not very odd for a deaf person to have 800 or 1,000 friends on Facebook. That's pretty standard and considered normal in our community. And we have friends throughout the United States, so information sharing gets quickly moved around. Deafhood is a new term and versus deafness. Deaf community are very offended by the word deafness because that is a hearing person's labeling of deaf people that they're less of. Deafness means that they're disabled, that they're a mistake, or something happened, they're broken. In deafhood, we don't see ourselves that way. We define ourselves and label ourselves as deafhood, that we value being our valuable beings, and that we're visual beings, we're eye beings, and we're very proud of our language and our culture. Very briefly, I want to talk about lip reading. Very, very common when deaf people meet hearing people, or a hearing person meets a deaf person in a store, or maybe a service provider. The first thing they want to ask the deaf person is, can you lip read? So hearing people think, well, what's their choices, their options to be able to communicate with a deaf consumer or deaf client? How do they resolve it? They're asking the deaf person to meet their needs. You need to read my lips. Deaf people hate that. They don't like to see that happening. So when you have a deaf client, you ask them, how do you want to communicate? Do you want to write back and forth? What's your means? Do you want an interpreter? So if you're a service provider, you want to ask them, what is it that your means of communication that I can provide to you? Ask them, which way do they prefer to communicate? And accommodate that. Spoken language is only 25 to 30% visible on the lips. There's letters like B and P. I remember in my linguistics classes of ASL and English that B and P, it sounds differently if you hear it, but on the lips, the movement is exactly the same when you do B and P. So that's just one example. At the state schools for the deaf today, we have quite a few. And there are 2 different language model programs. They teach English for reading and writing purposes. However, if a deaf student wants to learn spoken speech or lip reading or speech training, and they're utilizing some hearing device, absolutely. Those are programs and there are options to provide that support. In the classroom, they are being taught English so they can read and write, but communication, direct communication that is being taught, the method is used is American Sign Language. So, for myself, I always had strong access to language, both languages. I had 2 tools. Every child has that ability, deaf and hearing, to have full understanding of the world and how to interpret things. When you're working with hearing people, deaf people look at those clues and closure skills in order to catch and understand what the communication is all about. But most programs and a lot of the schools are not utilizing this method in the United States. So everybody's skills and abilities to communicate vary. There are bilingual programs, but there's only about 30, 40 years now that they've provided that, because the research is still relatively new in our community in this field. So how do they teach communication and language are 2 different things. American Sign Language is not being prevalently used, so a lot of deaf children have a hard time understanding. And of course that impacts their language acquisition, and their cognitive skills and language skills starts to be severely delayed. But there are a lot of programs and classrooms that do use American Sign Language. But it's not officially supported or recognized in official language in the schools or administrators. They do not see that. It's not part of the school's language of use or official language of use or approval in the school system. They tend to neglect or not offer that as a primary means of teaching language or academics in the schools. So then how does that impact a person who's deaf, who's a DV survivor or victim? So when you communicate with a deaf person, asking them to lip read, that's very difficult. If the deaf person chooses to do that, but if they have gone through a traumatic event, it's already difficult enough if you haven't been through a DV situation to try to lip read. But then add the layer of their traumatic experience, asking them to work hard to understand you and the process of receiving services. I'd like to speak a little bit about autism. This is a term that's been around probably since 1970, first termed and coined in 1975, from one professor from California State University, San Diego. He is deaf himself and felt that there needed to be a word that describes the behaviors and the attitudes from other groups, that how they look and view deaf people. We have lots of isms. There's racism, there's sexism that you're familiar with for various different things. But what about deaf people and their oppression? We needed a word for that, and it's called autism. It's not well known, only probably being used more prevalently in the last 10 years. And most of the deaf community uses that word, and it's being taught in a lot of the academics and post-secondary institutions. But deaf people can also have a form of autism, oppressing other deaf people. You know, there's always these cultural wars that we have, and a lot of ethnic groups have those experiences as well. So within our own culture, of course, we fight against the majority, which is a hearing, but we also have that within our own community as well. Remember that we saw 90% of the statistics of deaf children come from hearing families who know nothing about deaf culture or American Sign Language. And they don't use any language at all, or maybe a rudimentary way of gesturing with their children. Very rarely does any family will learn to become fluent in sign language to communicate with their children. And this is a common depiction of how we view, how we see, how our experience has been with being around a hearing family. This was painted by a deaf artist, where hearing family members too not interested in working and being involved, including the deaf family member, and tells them go out and play or just sit down and be quiet. So this is a true reflection of the majority of those children born to hearing families feel. Now let's go back to domestic violence. So the child grows up with a lot of oppression, with all this various different life experiences with their own families and their community. But then they go through a situation of domestic violence. They're easily victimized. And it's not our fault. It's the perpetrators, but it's also society's view on deaf people. They can't communicate. English is their second language. There's a lot of barriers. Our culture and our behavior is not understood by the majority. So there's a lot of barriers, and that impacts the DV survivor. For a hearing woman, they may, compared to men, they have experienced domestic violence 5 to 8 times, but for deaf, it's much more higher than that. Just like the groups that you spoke earlier, that Jean's talked about, people with disabilities. In our community, in our culture, the same is true. When I talked about statistics, unfortunately, we don't have exact statistics. The person that spoke this morning, she also shared, I think it was Morrison, that a lot of it goes underreported. And I'll explain why it doesn't get as reported as it should. When I mentioned our deaf community is a collectivist community, it's a smaller community. Everyone knows everyone. So the perpetrator, if that person is deaf, everybody knows who that person is. That person may look good on the outside, as you may, well, and everyone knows. But if I was the victim or the survivor, and I tell everybody, you know, he did this to me, and they're like, no, that can't be right. So then we feel like no one will believe us, so I might as well not say anything more about it. Within our deaf culture, most thing we're very comfortable with touching. That's a visual means, whereas hearing people may call across the room to get someone's attention, but we tap on each other's shoulder to tap the next person down the line to get that person's attention. When deaf people meet each other through mutual friend, in our culture, it's appropriate to hug in the beginning, and you hug when you depart, because of that shared experience of being deaf and using ASL. It's considered acceptable, but sometimes there's inappropriate touching. You know when it's inappropriate versus appropriate. So sometimes that can be considered vague, or they're just saying, oh, you're just overreacting. That's how you are in the deaf community. That's not true. Also, we have Facebook, as I mentioned earlier. People share information. The perpetrator, or even if it's a hearing perpetrator, they know where deaf people tend to congregate and meet together, either online or in person. That perpetrator will attend and can find their survivors easier because of their involvement in the deaf community. So there's so many barriers. It's hard to understand from the hearing person's perspective of how they're able to meet the demands and the needs of a deaf survivor. When you have deaf and hearing relationships, when DV happens, some of the examples of what happens, the hearing perpetrator oppresses and takes power of control away from the deaf survivor. And these are some examples of that abuse. A police arrives, and oftentimes, so the police officer arrives. Of course, they're not able to communicate with the survivor because they're deaf. They may want to write back and forth, but they'll use the perpetrator as the interpreter. Gets their statement first and asks the perpetrator to do the interpretation between the officer and the victim or the survivor. So that happens often. The perpetrator will also tell the hearing children in the relationship, won't allow them to learn ASL, that's stupid, it's dumb, and stigmatizes that ASL. So the deaf survivor or the deaf partner is not able to communicate even with their own children, because the perpetrator or the abuser is the one that controls the flow of language and who can learn it and who cannot, to even further isolate the victim or survivor. And the survivors, they don't feel valued, their culture, their language, because the general community doesn't also recognize or value that. English might be my second language and I may not be fluent. So then we're even more oppressed and looked down upon that we're not smart just because we're not fluent in English. So that breaks down even more of the person's self-esteem. Deaf survivors may report, sometimes they do not, because they will not believe them, and the perpetrator takes advantage of them being deaf. Here's another art. I'm sorry, this is not the right one. But these are other things to consider. So they're re-victimized through the process because they're not getting the accommodations that they need. As an advocate, last fall I went to DVS training and I saw the system, how it fails. It's not able to support or meet the needs of deaf survivors. I'm running almost out of time, but I want to briefly talk about that, and I'd be happy to be able to see and help you to improve the system about how you can work with deaf survivors and victims. And I'll briefly show a little bit kind of example of what we can do. A deaf survivor wrote this as her experience about the system when she tried to report and ask for help. The previous presenter, I think it was Leslie or is it Jean, had mentioned that people with developmental disabilities, they don't feel, or people with disabilities don't feel like they can trust the system. And that's also true within the deaf community. There are a few stories on YouTube that I would like to share with you when you have the time. First is Carrie Travers. She lives in South Dakota, and her son, she has about 3 or 4 children, I think 4 children. One of them was playing in the house, and he fell outside and he got a bruise. And he went to school the next day. The school reported it to CPS. CPS got involved. CPS automatically took the children away and told the deaf mother. They found out she was deaf. They said, oh, you should never have children in the first place. You're not allowed to take care of children. And her husband was deaf also, but he was in North Dakota working in the oil fields. So he was away 8 hours, and she had a difficult time trying to get a hold of her husband, trying to let him know that the children were taken away. It took 3 months to fight with CPS in order to get their children back, to prove that just you're deaf doesn't mean that you can't have children. This is a recurring story that happens to this day throughout the nation, where many children are taken away because the parent is deaf. So that is a huge problem with CPS and other service providers. The second story about Sandra Russell was about the interpreter services. There was a law that passed in the 70s where service providers had to provide interpreters and accommodations to people who are deaf. Before that law was passed, it wasn't set up yet. But Sandra lost her 2 children because she was not given an interpreter and she didn't understand the legal paperwork. She signed a paper giving up her custody rights to her ex-husband during their dissolution proceedings. But that would not have happened if she was given her rights to a sign language interpreter. The ex parte, Jean had talked about, I had one survivor that I had met. Before I met her, she was actively working, trying to work through the system herself. And then she decided to file ex parte to receive custody of her daughter. Her ex-boyfriend was trying to he was also a perpetrator and abuser to her. And when she faced the judge, she did not ask for an interpreter. She didn't realize that she could ask for an interpreter, but she still had issues with that. If she had asked for an interpreter, maybe she would have had problems if she did, and I'll explain why. So she had all this research and all this documentation. This whole time, the judge was sitting over and looking at the ex-boyfriend who was hearing, who kept talking. He took the floor and he was in control of the situation. After it was done, she didn't understand what was going on. And she tried to wave at the judge's attention, say, look, I've got this paperwork, I want you to read this. He tried to wave in his direction. He completely ignored her. That's common sense. It's hearing people yourselves. If you see someone waving their hands and pointing to a piece of paper, wouldn't you want to figure out what that's about? The judge didn't even care. And this happened in Sacramento Family Court. So now, the ex parte situation, after that, we contacted the office, the AD office, and explained the situation, what had happened. And the ex parte means they have 24 hours or less that needs to have a hearing be given. And we asked, so how do you get an interpreter? Because it takes time to get an interpreter. The ADA office says, sorry, we need 5 days advance notice in order for you to get an interpreter. But we said the ex parte takes 24 hours or less, and the judge is going to proceed with the proceedings. So something has to happen. There needs to be a better system for that is your job and your responsibility. But the ADA office says, sorry. So there's a conflict in the process in itself as well. They're not communicating with one another. Now myself, I had an experience with another tenant, and I had to get the police involved. My tenant had a bipolar issue, so I called the police and asked for protection. And I explained to the police officer, I can take care of the situation, I can write back and forth, but I want you to stand and watch and just be there, not to get involved or anything. So the police officer arrives, I'm trying to communicate with my tenant, and then because the tenant could speak, the police officer got involved, started speaking to the tenant, and after a while, I was not involved. I had no idea what they were talking about. And the police officer says, well, I don't need to be here, this is a civil issue. I said, I understand that. I can communicate writing back and forth with the tenant. I just need you to be there so we can do it ourselves. And you were there to protect. But hearing people tend to take over and become the dominant factor in controlling the situation. And providers and law enforcement deflect or defer back to the hearing person and allow them to take over that control when that should not have happened. I want to double check on timing. How much time do I have left? About 5 more minutes? Okay, thank you. Deaf and hearing people, how can we work together? How can we become better allies? I'll just let you read the bullets as I bring them up to the screen. So the concept here, different lives, different facts. Hearing Man teaches he's a professor at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. I really liked his quote, because we have different lives, we have different facts. There's no muddling the question, there's no need to do a self-assessment or anything like that. That we're all different lives and we have different facts. So how do we work with what are the immediate remedies that we can do in order to help the process? So for services, what can we do? How do we work it out? How do we work with our deaf survivors? The immediate remedies is to your left. The accommodations suggestions are to the right. As a deaf program provider, sometimes we cannot provide everything. For example, for legal services, I will work and collaborate with Weave, and we'll join together to provide our mutual client to make sure that they're getting the services they need. So if you do have a deaf survivor, please contact me or contact us over at DeafSafe, unless the deaf survivor is asking for something different and they prefer not to, then respect their requests. The don'ts, the do nots. These are tips for you to take into consideration. Very briefly, I want to explain what VRS and VRI means. It's a technical tool. With the technology advancement today, deaf people are able to communicate through the phone through a video device. This video phone device could either be a hardware or it could be a software means. And I can call a video relay interpreter. And we can see each other on a computer monitor screen. And I can give them the phone number of the hearing person I want them to call. They're wearing a headset so they can interpret the call between myself and the hearing caller. We've had this technology now for 15 years, 10 to 15 years. So video remote interpreting is different. Whereas you, as a hearing person, you have a deaf person in the same room with you, and that person you guys are in the same room, you wouldn't use video relay service. You would contact an agency that can provide interpreting services through the internet using a webcam and software computer. And that interpreter could be there to help you interpret between yourself and your consumer or your survivor. One person wrote this quote, when you gain an interpreter who's not certified, it doesn't have the training, that can damage the situation because you're thinking that you're saving money. Thinking that you're saving money and not getting an interpreter with the certification can cause great harm to yourself, to the process, and most importantly to the deaf survivor. There are various different ways that we can communicate. There's only one language. All these other systems here are just tools or other modes. Is not considered language. ASL is the only language. These are other ways that you can try to communicate, and these were used primarily, like I said, 90% of those hearing families and most schools are trying to use these other methods, and it's a very difficult journey to be able to communicate and express and receive information through those other means instead of naturally through their own first language. Certified deaf interpreter also is a person who is deaf themselves. They're specialized interpreters, not like the same as ASL English interpreters. They know the whole gamut because they're deaf themselves. They know the deaf world. They know from their own life experiences, the shared experience with deaf survivors. And they have that specialized training to meet the idiosyncratic need of various different groups of deaf people from throughout different regional areas in the country. Or persons that come here that ASL may be their second or third language and they're from another country. So deaf interpreters assist and help ASL English interpreters and the deaf consumer or survivor to be able to communicate more effectively and accurately. Video relay service, I just want to briefly show you what that looks like. So you have a person to your left who's a deaf consumer. They're using that video phone hardware that's on top of the television connected to the high-speed internet. They see on the screen is the interpreter. The one in the middle is the interpreter wearing a headset, and they'll interpret back and forth between the deaf person and the hearing person on the right side of the picture. If you have the software or hardware, either one will work fine, and it's interoperability compatible to other video phones that are out there. Obviously, you're going to need high-speed internet. Otherwise, if you don't have a good quality high-speed internet, the video streaming can be very jerky and pixelation will happen and occur, and you're not going to get a clear view of the signing communication. If you want to learn more about the deaf community, about our culture, about our language, there are various different videos and DVDs that can help you learn more. And you can be, in turn, become a better, more knowledgeable and aware person about deaf community and our culture. And I am from NorCal Services for Deaf and Hard of Hearing. The Deaf Safe program is next. That is one of the other services that we provide at NorCal. And this is in more detail of what the Deaf Safe services looks like. Now, if they're not a DV survivor, then they're referred to other client advocates within our organization at NorCal, and they can receive other services such as employment or education or immigration issues. But if they are a deaf survivor and they've experienced domestic violence, then I will help them with those issues. But I also collaborate with other deaf advocates in our office that specialize in these other areas that I just mentioned. So if you would like to get more in touch with me, here's my contact information. There's various different ways. The very bottom part is the Deaf National Services. We have a hotline for after hours, so forth, for you or for your deaf survivors and clients. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them now. And I look forward to working with all of you service providers, how we can improve the system together. Yes, you have a question?
Is there a cost for law enforcement with interviews? So if we bring a victim to you all, are you able to interpret for us?
That's a very good question. How do you get interpreters? Does it cost money? Yes, of course. And that's always a question of the issue, who pays for that? And there is a cost. And there's no one right answer. It depends on the situation and who's the provider or who's the agency that's requesting the need. So if I work with Weave and I have a deaf survivor and I contact Weave and I help them make the appointment for that deaf survivor and asking them to get the interpreter, if they're not able to, I will try to utilize part of my grant to help pay for that interpreter services to get it started. But for further Weave services, then we would have to take on that responsibility. But if you provide the service, generally, it's best that you provide the interpreter yourselves because that's the service that you need to provide, that you're obligated to. So you may want to consider, as you apply for a future grant, to ask for an augmentation for communication services, such as interpreting. Another time, for example, if we provide those services ourselves and you want to collaborate with us and we're working with our deaf client or deaf survivor, then yes, definitely we can help at times provide the interpreter services. That's kind of a gray area, and it's yours and mine and a mutual obligation. Any other questions from the audience? If not, thank you very much.